Hi guys, it's Blackie. Okay, recently I did a video talking about the history of the percussion revolver, and I've had quite a few people ask me could I do one about knives because of it, something like that, a little in perspective history of it. Okay, and I'm going to do this in a hurry because I'm running out of light. Okay, knives, as we all know, originally were sharpened rocks, pieces of flint, sharp piece of shale, sharp piece of a shell, piece of bone. It was anything with an edge that you could saw or get to cause friction to cut. That was the very earliest knives. Then comes the first real refinement, which was in stone, where guys learned to not just have a random, I say guys, but you know what I mean, not just a random stone, but actually learned how to craft an edge and therefore make an edge that you could repeat. I could make more of these, and that led to like Clovis and all these other famous spear points, arrow points. They were all an edged tool that was manufactured. Then came the age of metal. The first thing was copper, and therein lies the real beginning of our tale, because copper is not very forgiving at certain designs. If you make it long and thin, it's very flexible and it's too easily bent. So you had to create a certain design. By nature, it had to have kind of a thick midriff, and it would taper down to one edge, so you had a tough spine on the back end. So you had something that was a little bit of meat, so when you bear down, it didn't just fall apart. It'd be like trying to take a tape measure. You know, it had to have a spine on it. This greatly influenced design of knives, swords, and etc. that went on for hundreds and hundreds of years as we learned and improved. Then came, of course, iron, and then steel came about. And the whole idea here was the fact that when we took the design, it had to follow a certain parameter because of the way that the material let us flex and create it. Okay. Then you come into blacksmiths. Now, most early people that got access to a knife design, it was made by some form of blacksmith. And you had a lot of variations in styles, and they made the knives that were equivalent to what your local need was. So if you lived next to a seaport and everybody's cleaning fish, those knives would reflect that. If you're living next to a place that was butchering whales, they had knives for that. And so you had regional designs, so to speak, that came up. As time progressed and people began to crisscross a little bit, some of these designs began to flow over into other people's exposure. Now, where I'm coming from is I was a living history reenactor. That I started out 30 years ago in doing the Western Mountain Men. And I researched what was the period correct knife to carry for that. Shape, design, how is it typically carried. These were from museum examples and etc. And then over time in my living history adventure, we'll call it, I started getting earlier and earlier. And so I was no longer in really the mountain man, but I was more like in the early 1812, War of 1812. Then it was, okay, right at 1800. Then right after Revolutionary War, the Indian War. Then it was Revolutionary War. And then it was pre-Revolutionary War. And when I finally got out of it, I was doing about 1740, 1730s. It was a time period. And this was over a period of like 15 years that I learned and went back. So reversing that order for you, starting in America, and I cannot speak to the rest of the world because my knowledge is based predominantly here in America. Most knives were still going to be made by blacksmiths, but the colonies, like America was, the object of the game here was the home country, in this case England, and then the colony, in this case what we now call the United States, the 13 colonies. Their job was to create raw material, and then that material would be sold back to the mother country. The mother country would create finished, finalized retail, we'll call it, of trade goods and everyday things and sell them back to the colony. So I trade you raw lumber for finished pots, pans, cook sets, etc., Dutch ovens, etc. So Europe was much more advanced and much more industrialized than the colonies. So if I wanted a knife built, I had two choices. I could either go to a blacksmith and get him to create one, or I could go and buy from a trader a design of knife. Okay, and there was a limited amount of these trade knives. They only made certain sizes and shapes and designs. Now, how would they sell these? These were predominantly stamped out of a sheet of steel in a factory back in Europe. And they would punch them out like cookie cutters, barely put any kind of shape on it, wouldn't really be sharp, it wouldn't even have an edge. And they would stack them one beside the other like dominoes in a wooden crate. And that was what they shipped. When it got here to, let's say, America, you came in and you bought the blade. It came with a couple of rivets, and you could either make your own handle, or you could buy one that the trader had that already had a handle on it for more money. So let's talk about what an early type knife would be like. A modern equivalent that's still very much like it is a butcher knife, like this, like an old hickory butcher knife. Now look how thin that is. That was very, very common in the day. And you see it's just two scales and two rivets. That's how this would have been sold. These blades would have not have handles. They'd been stacked, just like, you know, poker chips, inside of a crate, and they already had the hole stamped in it. And then you got the blade and two rivets, so you can make your own handle. And so some of these were just rat tang, so you just heated the end up cherry hot and pushed it into a stick. And then once you got it like you want and you shaped it up, you'd take it out and you'd take that rat tail tang and you'd coat it with something that was a glue or adhesive of some kind and put the two back together, and that was a rat tail knife. They would pull right out, you know. We still have rat tail tang knives today. Like a Mora is a rat tail tang for many of the Mora designs. It was fast and easy, and steel was precious. And so if I could make a knife that worked with less steel in this part, I had more steel to make other knives with, see. So a thin knife was very common. A thin and flexible knife was very common, because remember what I talked about, how the material dictated the design? Now we had flexible spring steel, and you could get a knife that could flex and not snap so easy. It was only in the mid-1700s and definitely by the 1800s that these knives became readily available at the common man price. See, prior to that, it was a wrought iron knife made by a blacksmith. It may or may not be worth a flip. Or a store-bought blank. Now, what if I wanted this, but I only needed a short knife like that? Well, I'd buy this blank, I'd cut this off, not throw this away, this would become something else. Regrind and shape this into a little short blade like that, if that's what I needed. That's what I was wanting. It was very much like a kit. You'd get it, shape it. Now, this is a reproduction. This is a modern knife that reproduces what one of the French trade knives of the 1740s and 50s looks like. Looks much like one of our modern kitchen knives, doesn't it? It had this lollipop tang on it and this handle like this. It wrapped around the fingers, and that kept it from coming out of the hand and also kept it from going forward in a stab. So you could grab it and do this type stuff with it. It's a tapered blade where it's a thicker spine and a thinner edge, and it's just a flat taper on both sides of it. This was a French trade pattern, commonly called a lollipop tang, because of that big hunk of metal. And it was a full tang, very wasteful. So this was an upgrade, a more expensive knife than, say, what we would recognize as a butcher knife. Now this tip wasn't exactly there yet, but you get the idea, okay? So that'd be like one step up. Now when you looked at knives of the Revolutionary War time period and the French and Indian War time period, the average age was somewhere around 5 to 7 inches. The tips on them were either like a sort of a clip point, or it was just a straight taper. Dueling had not become really prevalent yet, and so that type of fighting knife was not around. You had these small, very tapered thin knives which think of a modern mora. That was called a scalping knife for obvious reasons. It was for cleaning small game and that type deal. And those blades were sold at that time. Many of the Native Americans got them and would wear them around their neck in a neck sheath because they did not wear pockets. They wore like a loincloth and a strip. They didn't have pockets to put stuff in. They normally didn't carry a bag. It was just quick and on them, and so they'd put it here where they could put an arm through it and tuck it up under their armpit. Most time it rode up under the armpit right here where they could grab it and pull it and put it back and be out of the way. Those thin, narrow knives. Then you had the belt knife, like a butcher knife, think of. And then there was these bigger, heavier knives, often used much like we would use, like you think of a cleaver or something like that, or even like a tracker knife. They were a bigger, heavier knife for splitting, kindling. You even do see reference for something called a kindling knife. And that was a bigger, thicker knife that was used for splitting up wood. Now, in a job, let's say you made shingles for roofs, or you made cooperage for barrels or things like that, you would have specific tools for that. After the Revolutionary War, knives were getting more, I'd say, more stylized. There were long knives. There were the long hunter knife. It was a style that people recognized. By the early 1800s, you had the Natchez knife. You had what we now call the Arkansas toothpick, which was just a straight taper to a point. It started becoming more of the dueling knives, like I spoke of in earlier videos, where people would wear these very prominently out open to show. The Bowie knife was probably the most famous of this, and that name was as synonymous, as recognizable today as, like you say, a K-bar knife in World War II in the Marines. When you said a Bowie, everybody knew exactly what you were talking about. And so, early 1800s, these knives have got bigger and wider because they're more of a stylized. It's almost like a short sword at this point, and it's meant for intimidation. That I wear it on my side and it stands out and you can see it. That don't mess with me. Again, that's a lot of those coffin handle knives sticking up there. They were not good as a working knife. You still used the little working knives, but you did use them as a display knife. Once we started going west, you see the knives begin to change again. And that's when you see more of the skinning knives, because what are they doing? They're doing the fur trade. They're skinning beaver back here in the east, and that's what drove the economy. They're skinning deer. In the early, I believe it was 1722, 1724, something like that, Alabama, which was French territory back then, shipped out 300,000 deer pelts in 1 year out of Mobile. That's many people. So these small little skinning knives were very, very prevalent. A butcher type knife was also very prevalent. By, like I said, the mid 1800s, the knives have become kind of specialized. And then at the end of that time period, you had the Civil War. Again, the fighting knives come out. The Bowies, the big broad knives and things like that. And you see that in period pictures of the day. But if you'll pay attention a lot of times in the non-posed pictures, and there are very few of those, but you'll notice these small knives on the kitchen table. They're still using the workaday knife, the butcher type knife. Now, I don't have a Bowie knife handy, but this clip point, like this Cold Steel SRK, this is a Bowie type clip point. That tip was for piercing. You see it a lot to be used in big bulk processing of game. They're not actually butchering. They're just simply going in, cutting to the bone and pulling out. That's a reinforced tip, basically, all the way up to there. And so remember, the metal dictates the use. I would have a thick spine on it where I could bear down and shove down into that meat and cut out. Because I'm taking the haunch or the shoulder off of a buffalo or off of an elk or something like that. These are market hunter and meat hunters. They're not trying to be pretty. This isn't the fancy. That's a butcher that actually turns it into fine, fancy cuts. Their job is to get that big hunk of meat off and get it salted down in a barrel to get it back. That way it doesn't rot quickly. We didn't have refrigeration yet. So knife design was dictated by that. Now we come to the more modern. And to the person that said didn't want me edge, all of my knife edges are facing away from me. Thank you for pointing that out. At the end of the 1800s, you begin to see a change in what we would call recreation. Prior to that, the concept of going camping just for fun, very, very few would do that. You're out here to explore, you're out here to gather food, you're out here mapping, surveying, working like that. The idea of leisure to go out there. When you look in the 1870s and Custer went out in the Black Hills on a hunting expedition, that made national headlines. One, it was because it was him and who was with him, but the fact they were going just on such a grand hunt. What do you mean we're not going out to war or whatever, we're just going to hunt? That brought attention. And so this concept of the going to the woods for the leisure is just in its infancy. By the very late 1800s, you're seeing the transition from the woodsman to the city dweller. And that's when you start seeing Nez Monk come into this picture. Because Nez Monk had started out where he was doing it for real, full time, for himself. And now he's an older man, and out of nostalgia, more than anything, he's writing about it. About him canoeing these places in these big wilderness areas where people are coming out to relax and enjoy. Now, a modern equivalent would be like if I now went and spent 2 months in Yellowstone, and I wrote about it. You know, because when I was growing up, I was doing this outdoor stuff for real because I was doing it to provide food for the family. But now at my current age, being able to go out there and write about it for you to enjoy, that's what Nez Monk was doing. See, Nez Monk's knife is kind of like the first real bell that rang out about this idea of a bushcraft, woodscraft knife. His knife, which was shaped as very much, looks like a buffalo skinner that to me has been reground, probably snapped off. Remember you took a blank and made it? And made that hump back there. I know many people give you many different ideas why. My 2 cents of what that hump's for. Pay attention to what Nez Monk's talking about he's eating. Tins of food. I made one of them Nez Monk knives. I took a Russell Buffalo Skinner. I cut the blade off, I reground everything, and I made me a Nez Monk knife. And it's really good for sticking down in them cans and turning around and getting all the stuff out of cans. It does a really good job as a spatula on the campfire for cooking in pans. You ate off the back of a knife. See, the fork was not common yet. The guys in the field had a spoon and a knife, and that's what they ate a lot of their stuff with. And when you looked at the knives of the day, they were rounded and had a swell on the back of them, like this. Okay, this is an original Civil War style, Civil War time period in the late 1800s, eating knife. You notice it's rounded. It's got a rounded tip up here. That's because people would scoop into a pan, scoop up on the back of the knife and eat. Notice how it kind of curves? So it's got that Nez Monk type swell. That's what they were doing. They would eat off the back of their knife. So a Nez Monk, when you start looking at it, would make sense that way, that I could eat real quick meals out of the back of the knife. I could spread things with it. I could get out of tins easy with it. It starts to become utilitarian that way. Okay? In the early 1900s, this concept of camping began to take place. And that's when you begin to see these specialized gears, actual tents made up for you to go out and do recreation, actual packs like the Roycroft, the Wheeling tents. All these things in their infancy start popping up pre-World War I. The knives that are being, like the marbles knives. Go look at the old images, the old original marbles knives. These are very much the early woodscraft, bushcraft knife, because you still have a lot of the old woodsmen that had came up in the 1800s utilizing these designs. And they're trying to pass it off to a younger generation. World War I would interrupt that. World War II, between World War I and World War II, the Depression, a lot of people went back to having doing this for real, try to feed the family. So, you know, World War II, you see a lot of modern knives come back in. Because of this, steel is now available. The war effort, you get these knives created, the K-bar knives, which is a clip point Bowie. All these working knives were being produced, and then immediately after the war, they're surplus. And so many people ended up with these knives for surplus. Now, the bushcraft knife, the classic bushcraft knife, and this is one that's a Condor that I use quite a bit. This generic design right here really came out of Europe, and it comes like the grandchild of the Sloyd knives and the small working carving bushcraft knives of Scandinavia, where they carved and did all kinds of work. So these small bush knives became very, very prevalent. They have a good thick spine on them, a good taper, hold an edge well, and they're good for draw cuts and small enough to do a job, but big enough to do a job. And that's where that type of knife came from. Then you jump all the way up to the 1960s, 1970s. You see some types of knives, but it's more about camping, about backpacking and hiking and stuff like that. Knives are kind of being pushed a little out of the way. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, that's when you see bushcraft really start coming back. And it's largely, a lot of it is because of what happened with the internet. Because people in UK and stuff that still have this tradition of carving spoons and etc., you and I got to see it, and it inspired us. And that's where you get Ray Mears and people like this that had those kind of skills coming back in. And so their knife, Ray Mears carries a knife not totally dissimilar to this in design. And these guys began using these type of small knives. Since, say, 2005, you've got a new generation that's coming up now, and these are knife makers that now they have the market that's the woodscraft bushcrafters, and they're trying to design knives to fit their niche, what they want. I want a knife for processing firewood. I want to be able to carve with it. I need to process game with it. I need etc. and etc. etc. And so that's where we come finally to this knife. This is a woodscraft bushcraft knife. This is a Blackbird by William Collins. I was in some of this, helping develop some of this stuff, but you're in a golden age right now where specialty knives designed for you, the woodscrafter, bushcrafter, with the proper steels, the proper heat treat, the proper angles, repeatable angles, because now you've got CNC machines and things that can guarantee it's the same knife to knife. You can get Arsenal steels, so you guarantee it's the same knife to knife. You're living in a golden age right now of the knife, because probably about the time of your grandkids or something, they're going to look back at our era and talk about the era of when the Blackbirds, the Nez Monk knife, the SRKs, the rat knives, and all these others. Those knives will be as recognizable and talked about like we talk about Nez Monk's knife, or the Bushlore design, or even Tom Brown's Tracker design, the K-bar. All of those knives will be talked about just like we talk about those knives before. This is our contribution to the song of woodscraft. These are our knives, and this is how we pass it on to the next generation. Hope this gives you some ideas, guys. Please leave any questions or comments below. And always, thank you very much for supporting my channel. Till next time, I'm Blackie, wishing you safe journeys. Have a great day, guys.